Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Trevor Williams here with Global Atlanta. We are at the Constellations studio downtown in Atlanta. This is our office, and we are so excited to welcome you here today. You're not seeing my home bookshelf behind me for once. We really appreciate you joining us today. We have a very interesting program, and with Ambassador Jonathan Addleton. You might expect, given the bios that we've sent out, that he would be somewhere around the world, maybe in Pakistan, maybe in Mongolia, who knows where in the world he is. Actually, he's right here with us. So we are doing a socially distanced interview together in person here in downtown Atlanta. He was, by coincidence, was here in town. We were able to get connected, and also for him to deliver some books to us that he's so generously signed and we're going to have for sale toward the end. But to give you a little bit of background about this series, Global Atlanta, of course, is a news service that covers international business here in Atlanta, Georgia. We also broadened our lens to education, culture, trade, diplomacy, these kinds of issues, particularly just looking at how Atlanta connects with the rest of the world. That's kind of our main area of focus. This series is called Authors Amplified. We're aiming to make it a monthly series of book talks open to our subscribers and the public, where we amplify voices that are here locally in Georgia that have interesting things to say on international business or international affairs. We find that sometimes in the haste to get expert voices, news services here in Georgia and other chambers of commerce, other outfits that are putting on events tend to look externally, but we find that we have a lot of really smart people here in the state or who are connected to the state, and that's where Dr. Addleton fits in. And I noticed that we have Dr. Endicott, who is our first speaker, joining us from Korea, I'm assuming. Thank you, Dr. Endicott, for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. I will say, though, since we're doing this in a meeting format, if y'all wouldn't mind until maybe the end to turn your videos off, and that way we can make sure the focus is on Ambassador Addleton here. The Authors Amplified series is presented by our sponsor, the Atlanta Global Studies Center, which is a partnership between Georgia Tech and Georgia State, funded in part by U.S. government Department of Education Title VI grant that made them a national resource center. And I really like their tagline. They say that they're here to empower the Metro Atlanta region's global agenda. And that sounds like something that's close to our hearts. So we're thankful to them for their sponsorship. I don't know if Shebnem Ozkan is on the call, but if she is, she might drop the link into the chat. And that way you can see what Atlanta Global Studies Center is doing. They're doing some amazing work, bringing all the various institutions together. And you'll find some interesting events that they have going on, including a series called Race Beyond Borders that we're helping them with. So there's so many different discussions happening at our universities that are relevant to what we're talking about. So this fits really well into this conversation today, which is focused on, again, highlighting Georgia expertise in the international sphere. I'm not going to read too much of Dr. Addleton's bio, but I'll just say he's a five-time director of USAID, five-time country director for USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, in India, Pakistan, Cambodia, Mongolia, and Central Asia. He returned to Mongolia as the U.S. ambassador appointed by President Obama, and was also USAID rep to the European Union, and spent some time after his Mongolia ambassadorial post as a senior civilian representative in southern Afghanistan in Kandahar, liaising with the local communities there and working to coordinate efforts between the military and the civilian communities there. So we'll get into some of that discussion in our discussion, but just know we cannot pigeonhole him into one country or one area of expertise. He's got quite a breadth of expertise. And his current role is the rector and president of Forman Christian College in Lahore, Pakistan. And we'll talk more about that. Dr. Addleton was born in Pakistan, actually. We'll learn more about his kind of circular return back to Pakistan here later in life. So Dr. Addleton, thank you so much for being with us here in person, actually. And we're going to try to keep ourselves muted to minimize the echo. So I'll give it to you for now, and just give us your introductory remarks if you don't mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Trevor. I do have a few things to say at the beginning. I'll try to keep them quite short because I think this is better as a discussion. And I guess Trevor will keep that discussion going, but I think he's also collecting some questions too to ask toward the end. In terms of the framework, I guess this was billed as 2 books. I think there's actually 3 things that will be talked about. One is that book, Some Far and Distant Place, which is basically that memoir of growing up in Pakistan. I do say, though, it talks about 3 different worlds as growing up, one being the world of Georgia, which I guess is one reason why I'm here at Global Atlanta. It's very firmly planted in Georgia in terms of my family. Although I was born in Pakistan, my parents, were Middle Georgia connections, and that's fundamentally part of the book. But the other 2/3 of the book is about Sindh, southern Pakistan, where my parents worked, and also about Murray in the northern part of the country, beautiful Himalayas. There it is where I went to school. So part of this is Some Far and Distant Place. Part of this is the first memoir, which again has three main themes, if you will, Georgia, southern Pakistan, and northern Pakistan. The second book to be talked about is Dust of Kandahar. And again, there's sort of 3 worlds that are part of, that I was part of. This is the first book, I guess, covers 18 years. This book essentially covers 1 year. I've written 4 books, but these are the most personal ones. The other ones, one was sort of a study of economic impact of migration from Pakistan to the Middle East, which is actually hugely important. It was part of my dissertation, but exposed me to what I view as one of the big, huge issues of the 21st century, which is migration. And so that was good. And then I also wrote one on Mongolia, Mongolia and the United States, a diplomatic connection. And again, that's a somewhat more academic, somewhat personal as well, but certainly Some Far and Distant Place and Dust of Kandahar are very, very personal books. And then the third, aspect, I think, is my current role at Forman. I've been there only 6 months now, but I love to talk about Forman. I tell people I'll talk about Forman anytime, anywhere. Most people probably haven't heard of it, but it goes back to 1864. And again, I'll have a chance to introduce this very interesting university with a great connection. The other part of the framework, which I'll go through quickly, is simply the Georgia connections. And again, I think that's where Global Atlanta comes in. Trevor and I have known each other because of those connections for a number of years, including a visit he took to Mongolia several years ago. But we've usually connected when I've passed through town, and this is in the nature of that as well. The Georgia connections, Some Far and Distant Place, I've already referred to, is part of it is anchored in Middle Georgia, and I can get into that. Partly it was a Middle Georgia family, a Depression era family in terms of my parents. My father was one of 14, my mother was one of 8. I have the proverbial cousins by the dozens. I think it's around 50 actually, first cousins. And if you go into the second cousins, it's going to be, maybe it'll be cousins by the hundreds for all I know after the second or third generation. But it's a, it's a family connection to Georgia, which continues to this day. I've always cultivated and appreciated that connection. And of course, Some Far and Distant Place was published by University of Georgia Press. So when I sent it to them cold, I was thinking, well, maybe the Georgia connection would attract them. And I think it did indeed. It was published because it gives a window on a very micro view of Georgia, Middle Georgia, but then of course it expands to a bigger world, which I think is part of the history of Georgia these past decades. Second book, Dust of Kandahar, that Georgia connection may surprise some people, but in fact, I was deployed, or I was an advisor, if you will, or I worked with the 3rd Infantry Division, and people that know Georgia will know that that 3rd Infantry Division is a very storied division, is based in Fort Stewart, Georgia, near Savannah. And if you want a moving tribute to the sacrifices of that division, there's something they call Heroes Walk, which is basically a tree planted for each member of that that has paid the ultimate sacrifice. And that's a story in itself, but I appreciated the fact that my connection in Kandahar had those Georgia connections with the 3rd Infantry Division. As far as Forman goes, Forman Christian College, there is a support organization here in the US called Friends of Forman that does extraordinary things on behalf of Forman. And it's basically based here in Atlanta. So that's a Georgia connection right off the bat. And then our former Dean of Students, Cheryl Burke, is from Atlanta herself and has left a huge mark on that university. So again, 3 themes. I guess as the son of a pastor, the 3-point sermon is one thing that people, I think they get. I don't have a theological background, but I think they get in a seminary, the 3-point sermon. And so the theme of this is about, three different things, Some Far and Distant Place, Dust of Kandahar, and Forman Christian College. And within those books, there really is three thematic things that may come up, one being Georgia, one being southern Pakistan, one being northern Pakistan. And then again, Dust of Kandahar talks about that civilian world, that military world, and first and foremost, that Afghan world that I was part of for a year. So I'll turn it back to Trevor, and he may have some questions.
Yeah, that's a great setup there. So I kind of want to start at the beginning on Some Far and Distant Place. We sort of have the picture here showing you dressed up in the local clothing. And I'll say that I read this book for the first time on a 30-hour train ride to Mongolia from Beijing when I was going to meet you there and profile your work as ambassador there, and really enjoyed that trip. And thank you so much for your welcome there and your help in getting that story done. But I wanted to get somewhat acclimated or familiar with you before I went. And I had certainly plenty of time to read it on the train. But I was wondering about the title and the subtitle, for instance, Some Far and Distant Place. And, it is about a place that is distant to us here in Georgia, but I wondered if maybe there's kind of a double meaning there, in the sense that, in a way, Georgia, growing up was a far and distant land to you. Would you call it the same thing now, almost 25 years later, after having written the book? And then the subtitle, Muslim Christian Encounters Through the Eyes of a Child, I think is interesting, although it doesn't really tell you much about the investigative work you did in terms of bringing out your family heritage in the book. And so do you think that the title accurately reflects the book? And how did you see Georgia as kind of the distant land when you were young, growing up in Pakistan?
So those are both good questions. I do think Some Far and Distant Place, when you work on a manuscript, you have working titles. And I think of the working titles, that turned out to be the best one. I think it's an appropriate title. It actually comes from my mother. She wrote her own little memoir, and as she was growing up in Middle Georgia, and again, this is Depression era. I believe she was the first in her family, and the later into the family as well, to go to college, as indeed it was for my father, although eventually others in the family went as well. But anyway, she had talked about being inspired to go to some far distant place, which of course in that case was a missionary work, a missionary calling to Asia. And so that title comes directly from that line, Some Far and Distant Place. I think, far and distant is, maybe they're synonyms, but I think it has more power when you do it together. And I think Some Far and Distant Place is the way that you described it. It's true. When I was growing up, it was the US that was some far and distant place, because I spent most of the first 18 years of my life outside the country. And it was in some sense a place you looked to and you understood, and it was part of your culture. But yes, indeed, it was some far and distant place. As for the subtitle, what can I say about that? That's not me. That's the University of Georgia Press. This book was published shortly after 9/11, and I think that was why they picked that subtitle. It's not, I guess it's many years later, I might well have picked a different one, because I think you're right. This book is a lot more than Muslim Christian Encounters Through the Eyes of a Child. That's part of it, but I have to say that was a bit of a surprise for me, and it was the marketing department, I suppose, or maybe the editorial department. But it's okay. I can understand that books are artifacts of their time, and this one came out shortly after 9/11. And I think there was a thought. I mean, some far and distant place, Pakistan certainly was, but I think, again, that sort of connection with a bigger world, in this case, Islamic world, Muslim world, was part of the reason why they picked that title.
Well, tell us about growing up. I mean, to me, it was interesting to read that your home was actually in Sindh, but your real childhood background, I guess, was like the background against which your childhood really played out was in Muri, at the Christian school, the boarding school that you attended starting at 6 years old, I think. So tell us about both of those locations and what struck you. What struck me reading through it again this morning was not only was it Christian Muslim encounters, but you had Hindu families that were living close by in sort of a ghettoized area. And we should not forget that this was 15 years after the Pakistan-India split, right? Partition at independence. So must have been an interesting time to be enmeshed in that whole cultural divide, and then you're coming in and adding a third layer of cultural divide as your dad's come and your family's coming in as a missionary family. So talk to us about the environment that you grew up in.
Yeah, I think that was a very pronounced aspect of it, is these two worlds. Again, the US was sort of, back there a long ways away, and we would go every 5th year, which essentially means in those first 18 years of my life, I had preschool back in the States, I had 3rd grade back in the States, I had 8th grade back in the States. All those other years were spent in Murray, in a boarding school setting, starting actually at 1st grade. And, it was a very distinctive world. It was a small boarding school in the mountains, but it was a very important part of my life because it was 9 months out of every year. My parents would come up in the southern months. We'd have some time together, but basically my world was 9 months in a fantastic setting. I mean, Murray itself, when I start off this book, small town in northern Pakistan, if you go to Murray today, you'll say, what kind of small town? It's a big vacation resort now, and it's got hotels up the hillside and summer homes and everything else. But in my time, it was a small town. And it was 800 miles north of where my parents lived, at the edge of the desert. Sindh province, a very distinctive culture and history, informed very much by the Indus River, that massive river that becomes the artery, if you will, for water. By the way, along with migration, water is the other issue of the 21st century, no doubt about it, hands down. Water's a huge issue. But in any case, Sindh is very distinctive. And as you indicated, has an ancient Hindu presence that goes way, way back. And even before that, the Mohenjo-daro, the Indus Valley civilization, we live close to those ruins. And I talked about it at some place about how striking, time you go to these ruins that you imagine people living all those thousands of years ago. And so that was part of it as well. But I think the other thing, just to touch on briefly, is, Trevor, you mentioned that it was not so long after independence. Independence was in 47. I was born in 57, 10 years later. And growing up in the 60s was, as you said, about 15 years after independence. I think you have books that are called Echoes of Empire or whatever. And so the colonial era had passed in some sense, but the echoes of that empire were still there, very notably. One of the things that even in the 60s I observed was a road built by the Royal Corps of Pakistan Engineers. And of course, that was someone who it was the Royal Corps of British Engineers. It became Pakistan. It wasn't the Pakistan Corps of Royal Engineers, but still, it was a lingering kind of emblematic, reflection of that. And I think Pakistan Railways itself was in some ways the railway colonies, the canal colonies. A lot of that was there, but his time is relentless, and that was a lot of years ago. One of the things about coming back all these years later to Pakistan in a different capacity is simply to see how that country has changed, as indeed the world has changed. And so I think the 60s were, I think my father described it recently as in the early 70s as a sort of wrinkle in time. It was the wrinkle that I inhabited when I was in Pakistan, but Pakistan has changed dramatically in intervening years, as one might expect.
Yeah, I want to get into some of that too. And I wonder if you might delve back into the rationale behind your ending up there, your father's faith journey. And I thought it was interesting, you've mentioned, I think multiple times, that this was sort of Depression era time that your parents were growing up in. And you describe arriving in Sindh and viewing it in sort of like biblical proportions, like the shepherds in the fields and the mud brick type homes and things like that. And but it should be said that Middle Georgia was not, a bastion of economic activity at the time that your parents were growing up, right? So, there was a farming sort of community. There was a sense of people looking for stable work and moving into like wage jobs versus tenant farming. So I wonder if you'd talk about your dad a little bit, what motivated him and what kind of similarities or compassion you may have had for people having grown up in a place that was not necessarily, known for its thriving economy.
Well, we're fortunate that my parents are still living. My father's 91, my mother's 89. They have actually both written their own memoirs, and they've reflected on this, so I can, capture part of that as well, I guess. But no, I think it is a remarkable story, their story. And one of the things I should say about Some Far and Distant Place, when it was written partly in response to, I don't know if any of people listening to this read memoirs, but that's always been fascinating for me. I'm fascinated in the human dimension. I'm fascinated in in people. And so it goes, it goes back, that far. And again, the people aspect of this is what's so important to me. But I think, Some Far and Distant Place was written in reaction to what I, at the time, and this is quite a few years ago, referred to as the poor, poor, pitiful me genre of memoir. And that's a very strong memoir in US literary form. I mean, I don't know if anybody read Angela's Ashes all those years ago, and I don't think he follows so much into that. But there's plenty of sort of competition among memoirs over who had the worst childhood. And I never shared that. I felt very fortunate in all kinds of ways. And I think I use the phrase wonder and astonishment, and that's what I viewed the world around me, with a sense of wonder and astonishment, which I think even in retrospect is a good way to look at the world. It also is a book that reflects, the world didn't begin with my birth and all that. There's an old Pashtun proverb that says, "When I die, the world should also die." Because that's the gift we have. We have the gift of life and the time we walk on this earth. But from my perspective, we're part of a chain that goes way back, and that began before we got here. And we hope we leave a mark that endures and is reflected in the people that follow us. So this book does indeed, as you implied, talk about the family, and for me, family is important and where that comes from. And again, there's no question that my parents had this call, which was rooted in Middle Georgia, which was rooted in the spiritual life of that place and time, but ended up in the subcontinent, I think Asia. My father will say he read a book about Adoniram Judson, who was an American missionary that went to Burma. Also William Carey, who was a British missionary that ended up in Calcutta. William Carey in particular made some great contributions in language. And as it happens, my father learned Sindhi, as did my mother. But my father in particular, in a more academic way, did a textbook on Sindhi language. And that's part of his legacy. He did translation work as well. So, that's all part of it. And, then my story, the choices that they made shaped my life in so many ways. And, you do sometimes wonder if I had grown up in Middle Georgia, what my life might have been like. But they made that choice, finished from high school at a time when he was number 10 in this large family. And, the older sisters went to work in the cotton mills. They had a 5th grade education and went to work. And, one of the things we say, and I think you alluded to that, is post-World War II, Georgia, post-World War II United States had opportunities that they didn't have in the Depression. So maybe this is an accident of birth, but demographically, my parents came along in the late 40s, early 50s, where college was an opportunity. They went to Bible school. But I think even their siblings, the 50s and 60s were a boom time in Georgia, and they were part of that, and that shaped their family history, as indeed it later shaped mine.
How do you think you were able to avoid the poor, pitiful me narrative? I mean, I think that many parents go through this when they're taking their children into certain situations where they don't know how they'll turn out or how they'll adapt, right? Like if you're moving overseas, obviously your parents were driven by a missional call that they felt was worth it. And it should be noted that this wasn't something where you go back on a 10-hour plane ride. Like this, you get on a ship, you're going, and you're over there on your own, even though you're funded by missions agencies. But, how did you, and it seems that from the book that your older brother, David, was a bit more rebellious than you are. You were a bit more trusting of authority. But how did you make it this enchanting world versus a world where you felt like you were being deprived? I mean, I thought it was very interesting to read back through again this morning. I don't have that good of a memory, but I looked through this morning, and you and your sister would play this game where you would say, I got this, or I got this. And it was like all the stuff you didn't have, basically. But how did you change your perspective? And did you always have that perspective?
That's a good question. That's a hard one. My brother would probably like that characterization, actually. And I think that, I think that's a good one, actually. I think people respond in different kinds of ways. And to be fair, I mean, I think sometimes the poor, pitiful me narrative comes from dragging around halfway around the world. I don't think it's shared in our family, but I know that it's part of it. I mean, you're growing up in a different culture. As you mentioned, it's every 5th year. I also think, of course, we raised 3 kids that they churn, move schools every 3 years. I mean, I almost shudder to think what kind of memoir they might write. And it could well be a poor, pitiful me memoir, although I think that they've appreciated the opportunities. And I guess I did think of it, as sort of a life of privilege without necessarily having the money associated with it, but certainly the travel part of it, I feel incredibly lucky. And I don't know, I was a vociferous reader, and now maybe people don't read as much, but I was a reader from an early age. So I think they say about reading, you can be introduced into all kinds of worlds, as I indeed was. And it was this enchantment, I guess, that you described it. And I was actually just meeting my brother recently, and he described, I was sharing with him about a jar of Ovaltine, which was a sort of British kind of chocolate drink. And he said he recalled that the first time he had it, it was in boarding school, and his house mother proceeded to read the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I think he thought of it as a moment of enchantment. And so I think when I look back, it's true. I had multiple moments of enchantment. I have always said that one gift to your kids is a sense of awe and astonishment, but also the beauty of the physical world. And that's one thing we absolutely tried to instill in our kids. And that's something that goes back to my childhood. How lucky is it to grow up in the Himalayas? How lucky is it to every day walk a mile to school and see in the Pir Panjal range of Kashmir, on a very clear day, even Nanga Parbat, one of the great mountains of the world, incredibly lucky. But again, I think you use that word, not me, but I like that word. And I think I was privileged to have that as part of my childhood.
Yeah, and I'm curious about that. So part of what we do at Global Atlanta is looking at how a certain place connects with the rest of the places that are in our big, beautiful world. But how did you retain a sense of rootedness and identity in really both of these places when you were kind of in one and in the other? And I'm really thinking in a sense of like people here, or especially younger students who are told to be global citizens, right? Like they're told to go out and be part of the rest of the world. At the same time, I feel like sometimes that can lend to losing your local identity. And I feel like you've been able to navigate that dichotomy really well. You're very globally minded. Obviously, you've worked all over the world, yet something keeps you rooted in both of these places. And I wonder if there's a method to that madness. Is there something that we can grab hold of that would help us navigate a world in which identity is becoming more fluid in a way?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I guess I think from a couple of things. One is, the quote, which I've used, but I don't know if it's completely the right kind of quote, but it's Pearl Buck, who was a missionary kid in China of that generation. And her quote was that she was partly at home everywhere, but not fully at home anywhere. And that may be something of the fate of our time, when, like you say, identity is fluid and all that. I guess I've come to the belief that one of the things about growing up is an ability to have multiple identities and to travel between them. So I think that's part of it as well. And I think, taking it even a step further, I think things go seriously wrong when you have a single identity that crowds out all the other ones. Because I think most people are. In a very simple way, you're a son, you might be a husband, you might be a father, you might be a Georgian, you might be your religion might give you partly an identity. There's multiple ones. And I think one of the things I would say about that is I think it's not a problem to have multiple identities. Rather, I think it's an opportunity, and it's a wonderful opportunity in so many ways. So that's certainly part of it. But I think you are right, and I guess I've always felt that as well, is that you don't want to diminish or dismiss part of your childhood, your grounding, if you will, that family connection, which as I mentioned before, for me goes back multiple generations. And maybe that's a Southern thing, and maybe it's a Southern thing that's going to disappear because of the things. But I think I like the expression that in the South they tell stories. And I think that cuts across the whole spectrum of socioeconomic, race, and everything else. This is a society that tells stories. And maybe, Trevor, you're more attuned to contemporary Georgia than I am, and maybe they don't tell stories like they used to. But I think the storytelling is something I got, including storytelling about my parents' upbringing. And I think we've told stories to our kids as well. I think they have a more complicated job. I had the first 18 years of my life was rooted in one country, and then I had the United States. Right. They've traveled multiple times, and to complicate matters, my wife and their mother is Scottish, and I've said, lucky the person who has a Scottish mother, but that's also another dimension of their world. And I think that if they were sitting here, they would agree that they've been privileged by the multiple identities. They haven't been obstacles for them.
Yeah, I'm curious as talking about journeys and how do you get from one place to another. I mean, you have, I think you lamented at one point in the book, and we're going to switch to Dust of Kandahar very quickly because I want to leave time for some questions at the end. But you mentioned that your later visits back home were not by ship; they were by air. And you mentioned that you live 800 miles away from your home in Pakistan at that time, which I'm sure there were no, you probably weren't traveling by air at that point. So it must have been hours and hours. And I will say that David, your brother, was the one who really encouraged me to do the 30-hour train ride from Beijing to Mongolia. And I wonder, did all of that influence your thinking about migration as a topic of study? And did your growing up next to these people, these impoverished, ghettoized Hindu communities, and seeing the firsthand impacts of kind of the grinding poverty, like did that really drive your USAID work later on? Like, how do you see those childhood experiences translating into what you've made your life into?
Yeah, I mean, I've often said that the path isn't always clear when you're starting on it, but when you look back, you can see a pattern. And maybe there's a spiritual aspect to that, I'm not sure, but when you look back, it's a definite pattern. There's no other way to say it. And I do feel, and any new assignment I've taken on, you look to those threads from previous experiences that come together. I certainly think that about where I am in Pakistan right now, which in some sense is the big surprise of my life. But I think that there's a sort of looking back at that weaving, if you will, of one's life. And I think that again, I've been fortunate in so many ways to look back and see that. I think, the migration, I mean, it was a topic I was enthusiastic about and did make it my graduate study. And one of the things, because it was focused on Pakistan, was the realization that, people pass through and they think, well, this has been a stable society for years and years, but actually, like most societies, migration has been huge. In the case of Pakistan, of course, that included the independence and the huge movement of people between India and Pakistan. Pakistan is a religiously established state, that was part of it as well. But even the 1800s, during the British period, when they opened up the so-called canal colonies, which are a fact of life in Punjab, and there were new agricultural lands opened up, and people moved there as well. And of course, most of family stories, not all of them, but many family stories across the world have some, migration as an aspect of that. So that certainly was, part of that. And I think also, you mentioned the observations of poverty. I mean, many of the things that I've seen, smallpox, that seems like ancient history to people, but smallpox was part of my growing up at some of those communities that you mentioned. And of course, that's been one of the big global issues. Another thing is the way that I think you started with this is simply the, you are a certain creature at a certain point in time. So in the mid 1960s, it became as cheap, and of course you save time, to go by air than to go by ship. Before that time, it was cheaper to go by ship. And so the missionaries, of course, always went by ship. But by the mid 60s, you could make that choice. Of course, it was a lot quicker. And of course, the world seemed smaller when there were airplanes. Another one, which people may not realize, I was reminiscing with my family recently, 1971, the rupees had devalued by 100%. We're a foreign family getting paid in rupees. So, the 60s were a time of, it was a special deal to get a bottle of Coke. The 1970s was, we could go to the event and pick up a bottle of Coke. I mean, it's small trivial things like that we had nothing to do with, but you're swept in the currents. And of course, that's a small trivial example. The bigger event in 1971 was the war with India, which I talk about as a kid looking at that war and what that meant. The birth of Bangladesh, the first the Civil War and then the war with India. Those are the currents of history that move you along, and those are the ones that you are almost helpless in. I mean, you're part of that history. But again, I think that some far and distant place provides some observations on that history.
I think that's a good segue, because I wanted to ask you too, like, how are you driven to government service versus, say, to theological study or to service in the church? Where was that turning point? And then we'll get into how you ended up in Afghanistan, and I think it was 2011.
Well, I made that call early in terms of the university, and it wasn't that common in those years, which was, I graduated in 1975, which is a long time ago now, and went to Northwestern University. I had this fascination with journalism, and then later I went to graduate school at Tufts University. The high school I graduated from had 32 kids in it. There was 15 in my graduating class, which was the biggest they ever had. The year later, they had 3. And we've kept up all these years. I mean, it was a very intense experience in so many ways. But the path I chose was the sort of journalism thing. Northwestern, it was one of those things that you pick up a catalog and, wow, this looks interesting. And so I applied. I do have huge respect for missionary calling, but I've also felt like you had to have that calling. There's so many pluses from a strictly personal standpoint about, freedom and travel and all kinds of things. But I think it has to be rooted in a spiritual call. And I was impressed with lay people, if you will. I mean, I've maintained my, my spiritual sensibilities all these years, and actually they've been vital. When I think of everything that's happened, I wonder if I didn't have that rootedness. That was a gift of my childhood as well, was the spiritual identity, which of course only goes so far. You have to have your own as you grow up, and that's absolutely vital. You have to, figure out what that means, and you have to work with it. And, the biblical work out your faith and fear and trembling, I guess, is one thing that they talk about. But I think that one of the things that a church child gives you, if it's the right one, is asking big questions. And I think it's absolutely important that everybody in their life asks big questions. And that came to me early on, certain sometimes health events perhaps, but I was always very aware of the precariousness, the fragility of life. And that was a motivating factor, not something I came to late in life, but something I realized very early on. And I think, again, that was a gift. I do think of life as a gift. I do think of life as a privilege. And that's been part of it. And that's been part of my makeup as well. But I guess in the short answer, huge respect, and actually my narrative on missionary work is a lot different than the one I experienced when I got to university, because I think it's a whole lot more positive than people realize. And I think that's, there's always multiple narratives, and I like to remind people of certain narratives related to this, which are astonishing. Some of the accomplishments, both in a spiritual sense, but also in terms of hospitals and schools and other things. And of course, Forman, where I am right now, is the legacy of a missionary calling. And in Pakistan, even to this day, when people hear the phrase missionary zeal, it's a positive experience often, because it reflects commitment to something other than yourself. And that to me is one of the vital parts. And again, I was privileged to observe it. Some very inspirational people. And I'm thinking now of missionary doctors, Dr. Christie, Dr. Holland. Each of them probably gave sight to somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 people in their lifetimes devoted to cataract surgery in part. One in the north in Taxila, one in the south in Quetta, and sometimes in Chakarpa, where I grew up. And incredible. And that's an unsung service that has such huge impact, and something I have huge respect for.
Yeah, and part of that being, and this is my attempt at a transition. So part of that awareness of mortality early on, and I think you said it kind of hung in the air in your childhood, which I think is kind of haunting, but also interesting in what it gives you in terms of your perspective. But one of those spiritual influences in your life, his son actually died in the Vietnam War, and I remember you wrestling with that in the book. And that called to mind something that I read through In Dust of Kandahar, which is written in a diary form. Like it's just your personal diary. I'm not sure how much you edited. you could reveal or not reveal however much you want to. But the thing that struck me about your time in Afghanistan was really the ever-present kind of drumbeat of destruction and death that you had to kind of experience and be there for in more ways than one. We get into one incident in particular that really brought that home. But why did you end up in Afghanistan? And then, because this was after your ambassadorial service in Mongolia, and really the ambassador post was the aberration for you. You were not a career diplomat. You had been in all these USAID posts around the world. So maybe let's go back a little. How did you get the ambassador post? Then how did you go from there to Afghanistan? Why did that make sense? I think India was in between too.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Stanley Green, and he was the son of our pastor at Macon Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia. And it's a very sad story. I believe he went to the University of Georgia, by the way, which is your school, Trevor. And I believe that he volunteered. He wasn't drafted. but he was killed. I think it was in 1968, sort of the height of the Vietnam War. And yeah, I mean, again, I mentioned that we experience history in different kinds of ways, but I think that if it's a personal experience, it's always more strong. And so, I was aware of that. And, again, that's sort of a backdrop to my childhood, if you will, was part of it too. Of course, Afghanistan was many years later, post 9/11. I guess, so I talk about different chapters of my life in Pakistan. I grew up there. I did my PhD research there. I came back for my first aid assignment. And then I came back, actually, in chronology here, came back to Pakistan too as mission director. The circumstance of that was the Great Pakistan Earthquake of 2005. And so I was responsible with a big team and a wonderful team, actually. It was a positive time in the case of the world coming together to deal with the humanitarian disaster. And that was a case. I was in Cambodia and the earthquake hit, and people knew about my background in Pakistan. And, why don't you come to Pakistan? It sort of had a lot of attention. That was 2006, 2007, and an incredible year. I mean, 70,000 people were killed in that earthquake. Who remembers it now? But at the time, it was devastation. I think 2 or 3 million people were left homeless, population the size of Mongolia, actually. And so, again, I think it was the threads of my childhood that people knew, maybe a bit of knowledge of Urdu or maybe a bit of understanding of Pakistan would make a difference. And so, and that was a neat time. Afghanistan is more complicated because, it's a war zone and everything else. But I think some of that same motivation and the notion of public service, some people think you're incredibly stupid or incredibly naive or incredibly idealistic. It was the Foreign Service, and I had devoted my life. I had, was working for my country. Even going to Afghanistan, though, it certainly wasn't an ideological thing. It was a human drama that I was part of, and of course, it was associated with 9/11. People forget, that after 9/11, there's other kinds of things that happened. But Afghanistan, it was sanctioned by the UN. It was approved by the UN. It was not an American venture. It was a global one. I was always be impressed when they, looked at that those flags at ISAF headquarters. ISAF meaning international community. We had people from Jordan. We had people from Kosovo, soldiers from many countries. In the case of the South, where I was in Kandahar, the Romanians were there in a big way. Previously, the Canadians had been there. By the time that I was there, they had largely departed, but they were there in that region as well. And so it was a very international effort, and I just felt the threads of my life. I mean, I had been to Afghanistan as a kid. When I left high school, I took that classic route with 2 classmates in a bus from Kabul to Kandahar to Iran and on into Iran. A very different kind of world, but I think a sense of history is important, and certainly had a lot of sympathy and empathy for what Afghanistan was going through. So, I volunteered. I mean, nobody was there. That's the difference of the Vietnam War, is it wasn't a draft war. I was there voluntarily, and of course, as they say, everybody I think has heard this, and by now, I suspect hundreds of thousands, maybe even more than that, of Americans have experienced Vietnam, and often they're told when you leave, you may leave Afghanistan, but Afghanistan will never leave you. And that's the reality of those of us that serve there.
Well, talk about that. Talk about the content of your work there. I mean, you were working with kind of tribal and city government leaders, and you were trying to be kind of a liaison, right? Like you're trying to use kind of your development hat in one sense, but also your U.S. government hat in another sense, and meld those two together, and also your local cultural knowledge. So, what was it like going out and then in this heavily fortified kind of caravans in certain cases, and then coming back to a very heavily fortified air base in Kandahar, where you're kind of you're tasked with engaging with the public, but you're not able to really engage with the public except in these very controlled settings. So what was that like?
Well, it was actually, multiple assignments, multiple hats, and arguably maybe impossible at that. But I talked about the 3 worlds, and the more familiar one, of course, being the civilian world of official Americans. I mean, I reported back to the embassy in Kabul. The ambassador was my boss. I was his representative. And I forget the numbers now, but it was sort of the height just before the drawdown, and it was a steep drawdown. But when I first arrived, we had multiple well, we had, I think it was like 140 Americans under Chief of Mission Authority, and of course, larger staffs, a lot of Afghans as well, assigned to what we call district support teams and provincial reconstruction teams in 3 provinces. I covered 4 provinces, but we had people in 3 of them, sometimes in quite remote places. And I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. But they were involved. For me, it was a diplomatic assignment. I was on secondment to state. It was not an aid assignment, but we had a senior aid officer who I engaged with, along with U.S. Department of Agriculture and other U.S. departments as well. And yes, they were working on agricultural development projects. Department of Justice was there as well, working on justice kinds of things too. So that was the one world, the one I was most familiar with, although not in a war zone setting. The one that was new to me was the military. And I mentioned the 3rd Infantry Division was the U.S. there, but it was such an international effort. And I think that's one thing that's been lost. Even right now, most of the foreign soldiers in Afghanistan right now, and of course there's the big decision about, do we draw down completely? Right now, the majority of the foreign military in Afghanistan are not from the United States. And even in that time, they had, like I mentioned, dozens of countries actually, and it was a very intriguing aspect of it. Sometimes my conversations would say that, as tough it is for Afghanistan, there is something to be said for the fact that the world cares about what happens, and that was a development funding as well. But certainly the military engagement, and not just the U.S. military, it was again an international effort. But of course, the reason that was attractive to me, or the reason why I even volunteered, was I knew that there would be opportunities to engage with Afghans. Some of them came and visited us. When I would go to a small base, pretty much all of them had a meeting room, and security there was reasonable. You could have good meetings. So that's where most of my meetings. You wouldn't want to go to Kandahar very often because that was the way you described it. But the smaller ones lent themselves to that. And of course, I had plenty of visits to schools and to government officials' offices and even human rights organizations and all that. So it would amaze people, the mobility that I had. And of course, it was under a security blanket, if you will. But Afghans across the political spectrum were willing to talk, wanted to talk, felt like their perspective was important as it was, and felt maybe, in their case, perhaps idealistically as well, that their message would get back to Kabul or even Washington. And we faithfully tried to, that's what your job was, partly in the diplomatic sense, was to report about what's happening. So we had very serious engagements in very amazing ways, in ways that I don't think people fully understand, that we engaged and talked. And what we were talking about at that time was this chapter in Afghanistan's history is finishing. ISAF's going to be leaving. This was 2012, 2013. And 7, 8 years on, in some sense, even then, we were preparing for a dramatic drawdown, which is in fact what's happened over recent years.
Well, I wanted to get your perspective on, so one of the things that strikes me about the book is the ramp ceremonies you mentioned, when a fallen soldier, remains are put on the ramp to the C-130, right, and sent back to the U.S. You faithfully record everyone that you attend, and you talk about what song was played, who spoke, who said what, and as you went through that, I mean, I'm sure it flashed in your mind that could be me at some point, right? And you're in a dangerous setting. And then you have this experience where it almost was you, and it was 5 people that you were with. Can you describe that to us? And in the context of peace building, right? Is the cost of the type of peace building that we are engaging in as a country, is it worth it, right? You have the benefit, I say that, it's sort of a loaded term, but you've seen these things firsthand, right? You've seen the violence firsthand, you've seen the destruction firsthand, but you've also seen the government machinery and the rationale and the diplomatic aspect of these things. So how do you make sense of this time in both Afghanistan's history and your life in terms of, of its value to both the country and to your life personally?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a tough question with a lot of things that one might consider saying. I mean, I think part of this is to look at Afghanistan in that post 9/11 context. I don't think it will happen again. I don't think it would have happened other than 9/11, but that was a wound that this country had, and it played out, and one can look back and say, well, mistakes and all that. But the reality is it was rooted in 9/11. And even when Obama ran for president, Iraq was, of course, highly disputed for all kinds of reasons, Afghanistan was still perceived to be the, the right place to be, and the good war, if you will. And, I suppose that's, part of it as well. I think what I did see for sure was up close and personal, the sacrifices involved. And, they were undeniable in all kinds of ways. And you mentioned the ramp ceremonies, which were incredibly moving. There was also basically the Purple Heart ceremonies, which told about that. And I think I do actually say the most intensely moving things were on those small bases where you would have the memorial service. And, so it's a combination of all three. And, you wonder about that and, what it would do to you day in and, week in and week out. It kind of depended. I should say, when I think about Afghanistan right now, people may be surprised to know it's been well over a year since there's been a combat death in Afghanistan. Numbers are much lower. I was there when the numbers were high. And what that meant is that, yes, these were regular events throughout the course of a year and intensely moving events for all kinds of reasons. You mentioned it, and I guess if we're sort of coming on, I don't know how much more time we have, but about 2/3 of the way through it was on a mission, if you will. Of course, it was under military protection, and the South, by the way, was more violent than most parts of the country. And I don't know if I appreciated that so fully until I got there, but that was part of what we experienced. And yes, you talked about life being a gift and the fragility of life. I mean, that was demonstrated all the time. And I have to think that the soldiers, as well as the civilians, when we went out, as you call it, beyond the wire, the thought did cross your mind, is this my last visit? And actually, that's why I kept a diary. I mean, I don't know what would have happened. And in this incident we talked about, it almost did happen. What would your family think about it? And would it be that meaningful? Maybe not. But you live life intensely in those circumstances. And on this particular day, we did go up to Zabul. There was, and Speedenhoff had come down from Kabul. My translator, Nassimi, was there, and we went to Zabul, the province of Zabul, and we were on a walk. And, I had done a similar walk many other times. But this time, of course, I think the story that I've gotten was first it was a IED hidden in a bunch of pallets, and then it was a suicide bomber in a car. And, afterwards, everything that you can imagine, all the destruction that you can imagine, and it stays with you. I mean, this never leaves you. And, I tend to walk fast, and I was, in the front, and all this stuff happened more in the middle of our relatively small group. But, I threw myself into a ditch and basically, honest to goodness, felt this was how my life ends at this small town in Pakistan. In Afghanistan, north of Kandahar. Kalat is what the town was called. And it really is true that your life passes before your eyes, and it really is true that you think about your loved ones. And, that's why those relationships are important in life. You do think about your loved ones. And so, that's what happened. And then I did go back, and I survived, and I was okay. My trousers were shredded and all that, but I came, and there were the three soldiers, and Anne and Nassimi paid the ultimate sacrifice that day. And I went back to the States with them. And the way I'll end this is that, you go back on that plane, carrying that precious load. And when the pilot enters the airspace over Dover Air Force Base, and people have seen that ceremony, enters the space over Baltimore and Washington, D.C., basically says, flight such and such carrying American heroes. And the response is, flight such and such cleared for landing, American heroes coming home. And whatever you may think about anything, the fact of the matter is the human sacrifice involved hits you, and it doesn't go away. It lives with me to this day.
Yeah. I really feel like there's so much to unpack there beyond that, but it's such a poignant story. I might ask you to mute your mic. And I'm actually muted too. So that's such a poignant story. There's so much to unpack there. I will say we've got 5 minutes left for questions. If anybody has a question, if you wanted to drop into the chat, and we may go, if people are interested and have interesting questions, we may go a little bit longer for those who want to stay on. I've got enough to last another hour. We won't keep you that long, but I'll just ask as we're waiting, if anybody wants to drop any questions into the chat function. You know, do you what's your thought about kind of where we are in the Afghanistan conflict with this new deal with the Taliban recently reached? Do you knowing what it's like to negotiate with people in Afghanistan? Not saying you were always meeting with the Taliban, of course you were meeting with people from the government there, but how do you think through what's happening now? Even though civilian deaths are down, there's still, or combat deaths are down, there's still obviously security issues, and we're still committed for a longer term than we all thought at the beginning.
Well, yeah, no, it's huge issues, and you're right. There's still a war going on. It's just that the United States is in the background, and basically part of it is attempting to strengthen the Afghan army, and the Afghan army security has made incredible sacrifices, and even from day one, I think people, this is one of the things that people lost sight of. I know that our own military was obviously concerned over the casualties, but also concerned over the what's left behind, the wounded warriors, and there are plenty of wounded warriors in Afghanistan, and that's certainly part of what they wanted to do about. I don't, I've been out of it for several years. I don't have any, prescriptive things, but one of the things I will say, and we talked about it a bit earlier, is one of the, I don't know if you say it as an example or what, but polarized countries. What they're working toward and what the treaty agreement calls for is a government of national unity that embraces all sides, from the Taliban on the one hand to the current government as well. And that's tough. And what you really want to think about is societies that get so polarized that almost becomes impossible. And that's the concern right now is, we walk away, or ISAF walks away or whatever, and what happens next in terms of that. But that polarization is something that I think any country anywhere should be concerned about. And frankly, it comes from a winner-take-all attitude. And I don't want to make too much out of it, but one of the things about growing up overseas or traveling the world is that you can see things that go right and you can see things that go wrong. And the polarization in the United States is a concern, and a winner-take-all attitude, which if you spend any time reading the comment section of anything from Fox News to the New York Times to Washington Post, no matter where you are in the political spectrum, you have got to be appalled at the fact that in this country, winner take all, and you're talking about your fellow citizens. And that's one of the things of the engagement in Afghanistan, I would ask, because there, of course, you can look at the names and which tribe they came from, or maybe which type of Islam or whatever they came from. And in some circumstances, all your prejudices spew forth. And I would sometimes ask Afghans, I said, because they were becoming pretty big on the cricket scene, wonderful Afghan cricket players, they were making their mark. And I would rhyme off some of the names of the stars, which reflected all of the ethnic groups of that country. And I would say, when you see that, do you think of their tribe, or do you think of them as being Afghan? And, I guess my vote would be for, you think of them as Afghan. And so that's why I didn't really expect to maybe talk about the United States in this context. But if you adopt a winner-take-all attitude, if you display in the anonymity of the internet, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, and you're spewing this garbage about your fellow citizens, it's a concern. And the people anywhere in the world should be concerned about it.
Well, I've got one question from, I think it's we've got one question, I think it's from Mushtaq Mehman. He asks, what is your next goal in life after your job at Forman Christian College in Lahore? And I might ask if you would say, what took you to Pakistan? You sort of mentioned this was kind of the great surprise of your life. And Mushtaq says he is born in Shikarpur, Sindh, Pakistan, currently lives in Atlanta. Yeah.
Well, I love this this question. Thank you, Mushtaq Mehman. And I love people. I love the kind of people from Shikarpur. I think that's one of the parts of the country people don't know enough about. It's got a very interesting history. And if you go through the Shikarpur Bazaar, it's been a while since I've been there, and I'm looking forward to going back. But no, thank you for that question. I have told people, and I think it's true, that Forman Christian College is the last professional challenge of my life. I hope I'm there for a number of years. It's such a privilege to be part of that community. I haven't talked so much about it, but Forman Christian College is an amazing place with an amazing alumni list and an amazing history. And I think it is a place where you can make a difference. I noticed from Shikarpur, I often say that Forman has a campus that looks like Pakistan because, of course, we have people from different regions. I wish we had a few more people from the interior of Sindh, and maybe that's one thing that I could, obviously in the interior of Sindh, you look to Karachi, the big city in the south, where they've got great universities. But Forman's a great place. We get students from Baluchistan, we get students from the northern areas, we get students from the Pakhtunkhwa, which is the former Northwest Frontier Province. And we do indeed get students from Sindh, but I'd love to see more. But it really is the last challenge. It's something I think I mentioned at the start. I love to talk about it, and maybe on other occasions I can say more about it, but it's a wonderful institution, no doubt. And again, you said how long my next goal in life. This is a great final assignment because it's talking and it's working with the next generation. And you can't walk on that campus without being impressed by some of the people there.
Right. We are right at 12 o'clock. So I think we're going to end it there. We do have one quick question from John Endicott, who says, how was your cricket after spending all that time in Pakistan?
I love to watch cricket, and I tell people people sort of dismiss cricket. It's a wonderful game, and if you don't like baseball, I can see well you won't like cricket. But if you like baseball, you can really understand the finer points of cricket. Incredibly talented people play it. It's one thing I can't play, but it's like music. I love music, but I'm a terrible musician. I love cricket, but I'm a horrible cricket player.
Well, thank you again for your time. I will remind people we're going to have, I think, 10 or 12 signed copies of both books for sale on our site, and we'll put the links to the purchase in the follow-up email that we send to y'all. Again, I mean, these are hard to find, and especially with the signature of Dr. Addleton, Ambassador Addleton. So we thank you so much again for your time, for being here. I'm so glad that it worked out that we could do this sort of in person and let other people in on it. And we will see y'all on the next one. Thank you so much.